Sound check, sound check. Can you hear me?
We can hear you very well. Good morning.
Very good. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Hope you can hear us very well. You've got some instruction from Ayla in the chat box on how to use this platform, as well as the brochure that was sent to you before this seminar. I'd like to thank you foremost for your participation today and in the next 2 days. I'd like to thank my colleagues and colleagues of the Mixed Migration Center for organizing this seminar. I'd like also to thank donors who provided us an earmarked contribution, enabling us to have this type of event, even if funding is limited. And I'd like also to thank the donors assisting the Mixed Migration Center. This event brings together approximately 50 academics, practitioners, civil society advocates, and policy influencers. When preparing this seminar, I saw that I'm not sure that we are lacking policies to address protection needs for refugees and migrants along the mixed movement routes in Africa. We are more lacking maybe commitment to implement them and acknowledge their complexity, as we know there is no quick fix around the corner. There is certainly more data on protection challenge in mixed movement on the African continent when those movements lead to North Africa, and for some to other dangerous journey across the Mediterranean Sea. There is much less data on attention on south to south mixed movement, because maybe we don't want to see them or approach them in their complexity. For instance, we have a study ongoing these days with the Mixed Migration Center on Burkinabe and Malian citizens going to Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana. We are talking here about normal citizens, but also about IDPs, people who have been displaced because of the conflict in both countries, who are crossing an international border to seek employment. How do we call them? How Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana call them? Beyond the usual nice statement I often hear about freedom of movement and freedom of establishment in the ECOWAS state, how are those people treated in reality at borders when they have no documentation? How their protection needs are addressed on the territory of third countries? Would we call them differently if they were moving to the Canary Islands? I'll stop here. We hope this seminar will address some knowledge gaps, but that it will help us also identify new opportunities for more assertive or targeted advocacy for policy development, but also to reinforce, and in the case of North Africa, to build asylum system in the context of broad migration management. Building on the process of the Global Refugee Forum on the Global Compacts, our commitment is to use the recommendation on ideas that will be shared during those 3 days to update our own strategies at the cross-regional level, but also at the national level. We have recently released an updated version of our strategy, which is evidence-based and route-based, as well as an appeal for funding for us and our partners. But this document can still benefit from your input. Some fragile but real progress have been made over the last 3 years since the inception of our initial strategy, but a lot remains to be done to more consistently operationalize it at country and route level. This is particularly challenging at a time where the response to the pandemic creates additional competition for funding and sometimes more difficulties with access. This is bad news when considering that access has been already more difficult due to growing insecurity, the spread of terrorism in some regions, and the restriction imposed by some countries. When preparing this seminar, I must acknowledge that some of you may have challenged the subtitle of our strategy, which is Working on Alternative to Dangerous Journeys for Refugees. But this is an interesting debate in itself that we can have over the next 3 days. We really hope that our discussion over the next 3 days will help us identify solutions and ideas that are innovative, practical, and that can be implemented along the routes where refugees and migrants deserve a more effective response. Now, let me hand over the floor to the head of the Mixed Migration Center, Bram Frouws.
Thank you very much, Vincent. And also on behalf of the Mixed Migration Center, a warm welcome to all. I hope you can hear me well. Yes. So thank you very much. Welcome at this UNHCR and MMC policy workshop on protection challenges on the Central and Western Mediterranean mixed migration routes. As MMC, we are very happy to be partnering with and supported by UNHCR and Vincent's team to organize this timely workshop together. I think this is also an excellent and concrete follow-up to the joint UNHCR and MMC report from July 2020, last year, on protection along the migration routes towards the North African Mediterranean shores. And I'll say a few words in a minute linking back to that report. Looking at the program, I'm really excited to see such an excellent and diverse group of moderators, speakers and participants from different countries, different organizations and different backgrounds. And I would like to thank all of you, those involved in the organization of this workshop, and of course all the participants who submitted their papers, who submitted their ideas and are giving their time over the course of the next 3 days and in preparing these papers. I would also like to thank some of the main donors of the Mixed Migration Center, including the United Kingdom, Switzerland, and the European Commission, who have been supporting our FORMI data collection and our research. And some of the research they made possible will be presented over the course of the next 3 days. I hope that by convening this group of people, bringing together so many bright minds, we are collectively going to be able to push the discussion on mixed migration and protection forward. And what we really try to do here in the coming 3 days and after that is to make sure that we bring our research and our knowledge into policy, into action, and into advocacy, and to try and contribute to evidence-based, nuanced, rational, and very important, humane migration policies. And when we discuss the migration routes leading up to North Africa's Mediterranean shores, this discussion is as timely as ever. In fact, it's still desperately needed. When we launched the joint UNHCR and MMC report in July last year, we offered compelling evidence on the scale of violations, where these violations are happening, and who the perpetrators are. And we said that this kind of reliable data is needed as a first step towards action. Yet, at our press conference in July last year, I also said that we should ask ourselves the question whether we even needed another report like that, because it was not the first report outlining all these abuses. And it hasn't been the last, and it's not going to be the last, I'm afraid. But we still see an unacceptable level of abuse along those land routes. We still see on a daily basis people intercepted at sea, brought back to Libya, with many ending up in detention. Now, we all understand there is a need to control migration, a need for migration governance, and nobody is in favor of dangerous, irregular migration journeys. But often it's the only option for people who feel compelled to move for whatever reason. What we also said is that ultimately, when it comes to mixed migration, instead of real solutions, we still see a sense of political panic and ad hoc actions to contain movements. Well, what we need is more humane and more smarter ways that would also lead to far less suffering, and that helps to uphold our principles and moral values. And it is possible. It requires courage, accountability, leadership, and innovation, but it's possible. It also requires that we never forget that behind all the numbers and data and statistics, there are people, individual human beings, men, women, and children, each with their own life story. And as MMC, we talk to many of them on a daily basis at many points along the journeys through our 4MI data collection program. So in our work, we always strive to reflect those voices from the ground. And we are therefore also really honored to have 2 of our 4MI monitors who are conducting all these interviews joining us and speaking during this workshop. Now, before I close, I've been asked to share a couple of words on logistics and housekeeping. Some of those instructions are also included in the chat box already. But first of all, please make sure you are using the most up-to-date desktop version of Zoom so that everything works properly. Secondly, please note that all panels will be live streamed and recorded, but that the discussions will not, and those are subject to Chatham House rules. So in this vein, we really encourage you to use social media, to use the hashtag created for this event, as long as you do not attribute content from the closed discussion sessions to anyone. Please use the Q&A box for questions only, which we will be closely monitoring. But the chat box is more for commentary or to raise any technical problems. The exceptions are the panelists who will have to ask their questions in the chat box, but they can also answer questions in the Q&A, so which I encourage them to do, of course. So to all, please be reminded that there are discussions that can take place in the Q&A. So please don't forget to check there every now and then. We have simultaneous translation during this workshop, but only for those in the workshop. So those who are watching us on the live stream will only hear the original language. With this in mind, the issue of translation, please raise your hand before you want to speak, and the moderator will call on you so that we keep things smooth for the interpreters. If you are presenting, your moderator will give you a 5-minute warning and then a 1-minute warning if you're close to running out of time. To all the panelists, please keep your video on during the discussion sessions, but during the individual presentations, only the speaker should have their video on. During the discussions, we will be able to unmute non-panelists when any questions arise. So again, please use the hand raising feature and we can give you the floor. And finally, for the agenda, just a reminder that all the times in the program are Tunisia time, which at the moment is also the same as Geneva or Brussels time. So finally, as I said before, the housekeeping rules, we need courage, we need leadership and innovation. And for that, we need an open, free and honest discussion. And if we do that, I'm confident that collectively we can contribute to better policies on mixed migration and better protection for all people on the move. So with that, I'm happy to hand over to the moderator of the first panel of today, Ambassador Joost Klarenbeek, who is the Special Envoy for Migration of the Netherlands. In addition to that, Joost also currently chairs the EU Horn of Africa Migration Dialogue, also known as the Khartoum process, and he sits on the strategic board of the EU Emergency Trust Fund for Africa. I wish you all an excellent workshop with very fruitful discussions. Thank you very much. Joost, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bram. Just check in, can you hear me properly? That's wonderful. Thank you very much, Bram, and thank you for your very kind introduction. And welcome to all of you, all participants, and very warm welcome, especially, of course, to today's speakers, including our first keynote speaker, Vincent Cochetel. I will keep things brief here. I think, Bram, in your introduction, you made perfectly clear what the aim is for today. I'm honored to have been invited. I'm also honored to share this first stage with a person I think we all know, have heard from, spoken to, or listened to. Vincent Cochetel, the UNHCR Special Envoy for the Central Mediterranean situation. Man, I think we all know as being, on one hand, firmly rooted in field experience, but at the same time, always ready to think creatively, to take thinking further, and to make new connections. I mean, Bram just said, what we need here is leadership and innovation. And I think that is something that we can expect here. Vincent, your very brief introduction, you mentioned that there is no lack of policies, but there's maybe a lack of, interconnections, bringing things together, making the connections, connecting the dots and making sure they work. So I very much look forward to hearing your views and invite you to take the floor with your keynote regarding critical approaches to trafficking in persons and policy. Vincent, it's up to you.
Thank you very much, Joyce, and good morning. I'll be using a short PowerPoint presentation, so please do not expect from me necessarily a well thought through academic piece. I just want to share some remarks with you on what I observe as a concerned practitioner with my colleague along those routes leading to the central or the Western Mediterranean. Next slide, please. If we look at the movement today, they have not fundamentally changed. We see just more movement from the Canary Island to the Canary Island, departing from the West Sahara territory, as well as from several countries on the west coast of Africa. This is not a new route. This is an old new route. We have seen also this year much more movement from Tunisia and from Algeria by sea than before. In terms of movement by land, we have to rely upon the data of IOM, in particular their displacement tracking metrics, and we see that those movements continue with the measures taken to contain the spread of the pandemic. We've seen many land border closing on the African continent. I think 43 countries imposed very strict border closure. However, this only led to smugglers and traffickers to be just more imaginative about the offers they propose to migrants and refugees on the move. I'll be using more the expression trafficker than smuggler, because we realize in that study that we've conducted with the Mixed Migration Center, and which is based mainly on their data, on the data of their partner, that the closer we approach to some borders, the more the distinction between smuggler and trafficker become obsolete. There is always a degree of abuse, a degree of coercion. So I'll be speaking more of trafficker than smuggler today. I know the legal difference. I'm not sure they matter much in practice today on the African continent, but I can be challenged on this one. I think since the publication of that joint study with MMC and UNHCR, I think we cannot say today that we don't know what is the geography of the risk. This map enables us to identify where the key protection challenges, protection problems, abuse have taken place along those routes. It does not necessarily enables us to visualize the complexity of the problem, but it gives us an idea about the location. And we believe that this should guide our outreach efforts. It should guide our partnership. It should also, to some extent, I hope, guide donors' funding towards the partners working in those areas. Next slide, please. Of course, we're talking here about routes that are not so modern. This is an old map. Actually, it's a map made 20 years ago, but based on data that dates back to the 6th and the 7th century. And this is a map of the trading on the slave trade in Africa. And if you look at the map, some of the names have changed. Names of cities have changed, but you see the big names. Le Khat, Al-Kufra, the border between Sudan and Libya. You see Agadez, you see Khadames, you see Tombouctou. Actually, those routes have not fundamentally changed over years, and that's important to keep that in mind also. Next slide, please. I think countries have a different sometimes perspective about approaching trafficking these days. And I'm afraid that too often in industrialized countries, in particular in Europe, we look at countries as countries of transit. We use that expression, countries of transit, but we should always keep in mind, in my view, that those countries of transit are hosting sizable refugee population on their territory. And it's actually only a very small minority, probably between 15 and 10% of the refugee in one given country that may be tempted by those secondary dangerous journeys leading to North Africa. I think it's important to keep that dimension in mind. Next slide. Oops. Yes. I think when combating human trafficking, states have divergent priorities. Countries of origin, unfortunately, in my view, do not pay sufficient attention to it. People are living, and to some extent, there is an ambivalent approach to that. We've seen that in a number of international forums where countries of origin clearly display a lack of responsibility vis-à-vis the fate of their citizens stranded in insert countries. Basically, it's the people have taken those risks. That's their responsibility. It's their fault if they end up victims of trafficking. So sort of stigmatization. Plus, at the end of the day, you know, if they had made it, well, maybe it would be good for the country because actually they would send back remittances that are badly needed at home for some of the families. So, and still an ambivalent approach, I think, by many countries of origin when it relates to the protection of their citizens when they end up victim of trafficking on those mixed movements. Countries of intended destination, countries of transit have a different approach to trafficking. I think countries of intended destination normally talk a lot about combating human trafficking, but actually do more about combating irregular migration than really about combating human trafficking. And we'll get back to that. Countries of transit, well, some countries, in particular countries in North Africa, would like only to see themselves as country of transit. They believe the people have no intention to stay on their territory and are just needing a few months, a few weeks to stay on their territory to move elsewhere. This is partly the desire of many people just to transit through North Africa, but we have seen over the last 10 years the increase of the population in terms of migrants, but also asylum seekers and refugees in all North African countries. So I think it's important also for those countries who see themselves as transit countries to realize, and I think they've done that when the pandemic spread it, they realized that they have all sorts of population, ghost population on their territory, a mix of migrants, asylum seekers and refugees who most of the time do not have the right, the legal right to stay and to access basic services on their territory. So as long as you see yourself as a country of transit, you may not feel the same urge to act when combating trafficking because you believe that the people are on the move and that therefore let's not invest on that. I think diverging state priorities also apply to the way we approach the security migration control nexus on the linkage that is more made these days with other traffic, including drug trafficking. And certainly when you look at the roads going through places like Mali and all that, you cannot ignore the fact that many of those manning the checkpoints on the road on racketing migrants and refugees are also paid with drug money. We know where it comes from and we know who benefit from those sources of income. So there is more interlinkages, the same way traffickers going from Niger to Libya do not only traffic human beings, they are involved in all sorts of other traffics on trade also. Now, on the relationship between trafficking in person, irregular migration, and terrorist threat, I think there are lots of myths on the real threat. Myths that, those involved in the trafficking of person are also working or are part of terrorist group. We've heard that a lot of time in Libya. It has never been proven. In the case of Mali, there are indications that some armed groups benefit through taxation, exhaustion of the movement of migrants and refugees, but they are not themselves involved in the movement of people. where it's a threat or no longer a myth. That's indeed in those mixed flows, you have also individuals who have committed terrorist acts in some countries, or who have the intention to commit such act in certain countries. And let's not be too naive here. It has happened several times on the European soil over the last decade. As combating the trafficking in person reached a turning point in November 2017, there was the famous CNN video showing slave trade in slave markets in Libya. It sent a wave of shock, of anger throughout the African continent and beyond, leading the EU, the UN, and the African Union to adopt a joint declaration in the margin of the 5th African Union, European Union Summit in Abidjan on the 29th of November 2017. On the same indignation and call for action was renewed in the margin of the General Assembly on the 25th of September 2019. But has there been any real changes in combating trafficking on the African continent after this wave of indignation? Question mark. Next slide. Sorry, can I have the next slide? Yes. Well, when you look at what has been the motto of many countries, not just in Europe, as well as we've heard the same language being used on the African continents, we need to defeat the business model of the trafficker. And I think we all agree on that. But we know what it takes to defeat the business model of the traffickers is to understand first that business model, including the financial flows that vary depending on the route, that vary depending on the networks, on how we go about them. And I have to say there's been little progress. There's been some progress, but there's been little progress in terms of international cooperation there. We see bilateral cooperation working better than multilateral cooperation in that respect. In terms of successful bilateral cooperation, I can point to the judicial cooperation between Italy and Nigeria, for instance, which was supported by other countries, I think the Netherlands. I can point to the French-Spanish support to prosecutors' office in Niger. It's an ongoing judicial cooperation project for the last 3 years. That's quite successful. At the multilateral level, we haven't seen much happening. A regional operational center of the Khartoum process was established. Its opening was delayed because of the events in Sudan, but also because of disagreement among states as to what this center should exactly be doing in Khartoum. AFRIPOL is still a very recent organization, but we see also already some of the limits of its possibility. And in general, when talking to states or talking to an intergovernmental organization like Europol, you understand that they have limits in terms of data, activable data that they can share with African countries. Those limits are linked to either data protection legislation. While we understand why this legislation is there, but we have to realize also that some of the data protection legislation constitute an impediment in sharing quickly information that could help combating trafficking, unsafe victim of trafficking. And there again, you know, as humanitarian, we use that expression, do not harm. That's a key humanitarian principle. And I wonder whether state should not use it in approaching that issue of data protection on data sharing in a relation with trafficking in person. We've seen also sometimes there is lack of trust between European states and African states in sharing information that is valuable. And this lack of trust is often linked to either human rights abuse taking place in the countries in question, or the poor judicial capacity of that states to follow up on the information that would be otherwise shared. I think in general, there is increased awareness of existing frameworks relating trafficking in person, better knowledge thanks to the training of many partners represented over the next 3 days, better standard operating procedures between organizations, but poor operational response mechanism for victims of trafficking in general. So an imbalance between the fight against traffickers and the response to to victims of trafficking. Next slide, please. I won't place that slide too long. This was a video which was recently uploaded on a social media entertainment platform in East Africa. It was viewed by 1 million person, over 1 million person. It was posted 10 days ago. But if we can just play the first minute, please press. Yeah, there is a arrow. There is a arrow just below the picture. Don't press there, just below the picture. Well, there seems to be a technical problem to do that. It's all right. We can skip the video. Ah no, here we go. Okay, let's stop the video, please, and move to the next slide. Thank you. So what are the lessons learned from this recent case? I've not let the video go on for the 5 minutes. So the video is a video of a young Cameroonian fellow who reports that he is trapped somewhere in Libya with 2 other 100 persons, and he is subject to the worst form of human rights abuse. Of course, there are all sorts of questions about the video. Why now? Why 4 months after? He says he has been 3 to 4 months there. Are we manipulated as viewers? Is that a ransom request? Obviously, if it's done so many months after his arrival in Libya, it's probably a video which is taken under the control of those holding him. The person is Cameroonian, so he has crossed through Nigeria or through Chad before arriving in Niger. And one of the questions for practitioners like us is why this person never approached us, or could he have stopped on the way if we had offered him alternative to this dangerous journey? Then he was tricked by his trafficker. Instead of going to Algeria, he ended up going to Libya. And that's consistent with the modus operandi of some of the traffickers in Agadez. Now, when I got that video, I made a few phone calls to some people I know and said, you know, what can we do? Because we get those videos once in a while, and we are the silent observer of this suffering. And the overwhelming feeling that we get is a sense of powerlessness in the international community. We have seen those videos now for a long time coming from Libya or other places. And you would think maybe international cooperation around these sort of crimes is better organized today. Well, first I realized that the authorities in Cameroon were not aware of the video. It has been widely shared on social media. They were not aware. They had not opened any inquiry. Their embassy covering Libya was not aware about the case. They are aware about 25 citizens reportedly missing in Libya, but they were not aware of that one while he was all over the social media. The fact that the gentleman had indicated that he was held in detention by both Niger citizens and Arabs, presumably Libyans, was an interesting information in that video. And it's quite interesting that the traffickers let him share that information, as well as release the first name of a known human trafficker in Agadez. I shared that video with the Niger authorities, and quickly the Niger authorities checked with their informer, managed to identify the human trafficker behind this case, and arrested that person. It does not save this young Cameroonian fellow because we still have difficulties to locate it. And as he may be in south of Libya, it may be difficult to reach him unless mediation is taking place between the people holding it, the elders in the communities where he is maybe detained, and some other actors that need to be involved. But it was quite interesting and eye-opening for me to discover that there is absolutely no communication between Libya, Cameroon, and Niger, the three countries that should be involved and concerned with the case. And we should not assume that countries are following up on those issues. So I think there is an imperative as practitioners to design a rapid response systems to make aware states that their citizens are trapped, and that action is needed. And that action goes well beyond what humanitarian organizations can do. Next slide. I think we need to reframe our approach to victims of trafficking, and we need to operationalize what I would call minimum standards in the response along dangerous routes, what I call protective safety nets. We are involved in the mapping in a survey to try to map what services are available along the routes. And there are significant gaps along the routes. And we are not talking here big money, big project. We're talking about partnering with community-based organizations, which are very local, which can identify the victim of trafficking along the route, provide the immediate assistance, and organize the referrals to organizations with more capacity to deal with those people. And we need, I think, to change that oversimplistic narrative. The fact that most of the trafficking cases in Africa have started as a transactional, consensual relationship between someone wanting to move and initially a smuggler doesn't mean that we should not address the serious crime that are committed when the smuggler becomes a trafficker. So I think we need to combat this stigmatization a bit of the victim of trafficking, in the sense that we see him as almost as guilty as the trafficker. He puts himself into that sort of danger. I think we also need to recognize the specific needs of a victim of trafficking when we're looking at solutions. Often the solution is just return to the home country, even if we don't realize that the person is trapped in debt bondage, because there was money paid up front normally for the travel, and the person will have to repay that money one way or the other. So the trafficking may not stop with the return to the home country. The trafficking may continue or even increase with the return back home. And we know of certain nationalities, certain profile, and often women, that are more likely to become re-trafficked when sent back home. Are there alternative solutions? That's a question to be discussed, especially in West Africa, when we have a space for freedom of establishment. Is that the best solution for a Nigerian woman today trafficked for sexual purposes in Mali? Is that the best solution for her to return to Nigeria? Are there other options available in West Africa for such a woman? Can we also look at victims of trafficking as people with important information that could help combating trafficking, as key witnesses? Can we look at them as people who are in need of access to justice? And what are the ethical considerations we should observe in that respect? Time is limited. I can't further develop on that, but I'm sure some of the next speakers will approach these questions. Next slide, please. I think that's over. That's where I wanted to leave it, calling really for rebalancing all what needs to be done in terms of combating trafficking, with certainly more international cooperation on state-to-state cooperation, with reframing our approach to victims of trafficking, in particular looking at the issue of access to justice and diversified solution for victims of trafficking. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'll stay with you over the next 3 days. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Vincent, and thank you very much for well, making us think and really setting the scene, I think, for further discussions this morning and in the coming days. You really showed very clearly no lack of policies, but maybe a lack of international cooperation and a need of balance. I mean, you mentioned a few specific items, like the need to collect and share data, problems with data protection, a lack of trust, be it between European African countries or among African countries, or between countries and NGOs and international organizations. And it all ends up, as you clearly showed with your very marked example, that this ends up with a poor operational response. And that we need to find ways to connect these dots between all these different players and all these different elements and all these people and institutions that have a bit of information, but do not always bring it together. I must say I was impressed with the case of the man from Cameroon that you mentioned, and basically the role of your own office, where you actually show that if you do connect the dots, that rapid response is possible. But of course, we cannot rely on a small UNHCR office to be a sort of one-man rapid response office. And we need, as you said, build these protective safety nets by connecting, because there is so much data available. And we really have to think how we can bring this information together, first of all, and circulate it to those who need it, be they countries of transit, of origin, or destination. So how do you think we can operationalize this and operationalize this anti-trafficking effort around organizations with very different mandates, very different roles when you actually encounter cases of trafficking, as you showed in your example? How can we create an accessible platform to report suspicions and experiences with certain traffickers or individual cases of suspected trafficking? How do we bring this together so that it can be used by by prosecuting officers, but also with those who have a mandate to protect, like, as you mentioned, embassies of countries of origin. Often the information is available, but we can't bring it together. And would you, Vincent, maybe have a few ideas on how we can explore this option further? Because as you said, information is available. There's lots of policies, but we have to bring it together. Can you maybe say a few words about that?
Yeah, thank you. I think we should start small and recognize that the problem facing us are huge and are complex. But I think the cooperation that was that existed between Italy, the Netherlands, Nigeria was a promising one. The one France, Spain, and Niger is also working. So I think we need to recognize sometime the capacity problems states are facing in Africa to look at trafficking in a comprehensive and holistic manner. And I think that is the beauty of the project in Agadez, where you have a team supporting the prosecutor, but you have also agencies around helping with the victim of trafficking and providing solutions. So a well-integrated approach. It has been the case in the past in Sudan. It's more difficult now because there is a problem of access sometimes to some of those victims of trafficking. But as we've seen on the first map on my presentation, the risks are different. So I would propose first to really focus on Sudan, focus on Niger, focus on Mali if it's possible, rather than to spread too thin on all the routes, on all the possible places where people may be subject to this crime. And then if multilateral cooperation is too complicated, let's go bilateral, let's go small projects, state to state, twinning, but long term. Because I remember visiting the prosecutor's office in Agadez in 2017. What they were lacking was basic case management system, basic tools. For instance, they had arrested someone suspected of trafficking. They were quite sure that they had caught the right guy. It was from Nigeria. They managed to seize his mobile telephone. He had more than 10 mobile telephones. And they kept his arrest secret for something like 48 hours. And for 48 hours, the 10 mobile telephones were active. And but then you needed 3-4 interpreters possibly to respond to the phones in order to maintain the illusion that the guy was not under arrest and try to get as much information as possible. I mean, the prosecutors would have needed maybe 3-4 interpreters to keep that evidence active and collect more data on the network, and possibly release also some of the people stranded on the route. So small cooperation, that's what I would, small cooperation project, that's what I would recommend, but holistic one. Not just focus on combating trafficking, but also on taking good care of victims of trafficking, on recognizing our people who have a right to get access to justice.
Thank you very much, Vincent. And I'm, really triggered by your emphasis that, victims need to be recognized with their specific protection needs, but also at the same time be considered as key witnesses in going after the traffickers. One other point, fortunately there's not much time. One other point I wanted to, that I found particularly important in your presentation was with your Cameroon example. You said this man has traveled through a number of countries before arriving in Libya. And how come that we don't have any, nobody had access to him, or he did not have access to anyone, apparently, along the route? So we need to map out the protection service available for victims along the routes and hopefully protect them before they cross to Libya. Now, there are some interesting examples of cooperation between UNODC,